Hi, everybody. It's Jamie Sarche, Director of Pre-Planning at Feldman Mortuary, and I'm so glad for you to be here for the last session of the Before the Morning series. And we are so lucky today to have Vanessa Johnston, who really is an expert in end-of-life issues. She is a death doula and is the vice president of the Colorado End of Life Collaborative. And she just really is an all-around lovely person. She and I have known each other for some time, and I feel so grateful to know her. She's gonna have wonderful things to present to us today, but I also want you to feel free to ask questions. And you can ask questions by putting your hand up in the chat function. You can write questions into the chat, or you can just go like this and I will call on you. Thank you all for being here. And Vanessa, thank you so much for being here, and can't wait to learn from you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I'm so grateful to Jamie and Feldman for, first of all, hosting this wonderful series and for inviting me to be part of it. So I'm thrilled to be here. I don't know if any of you have come to the previous topics, but Kelly O'Connor did Living the Legacy You Want to Leave, and then Maggie Miller talked about program for adult children of older parents, and then if you were here last week, Jamie talked about green burial and human composting and all those things. And so yeah, I'm really glad to be coming up and ending the program and to be here with you all today. We're going to talk about the death positive movement, which is kind of a really big thing, and we're going to specifically talk about end-of-life doulas, death cafes, and home funerals. But like Jamie said, if you have any questions, just put it in the chat, raise a hand in the chat, or put it on your screen, and so we'll just go from there. So I'm really honored to participate. I have been an end-of-life doula since 2017. And in 2018, I established my own business. So it's called Denver EOL Doula LLC. And then last year, as Jamie mentioned, I'm part of a nonprofit organization. I helped co-found that, and it's called the Colorado End of Life Collaborative. And we are looking to be a resource, an online resource for people who are experiencing death and dying, and really it's hard to make decisions when you're in that space. So we try and provide all the information for people that need it. And I can give you that website later, and we can maybe look at that. But today we're going to talk about the death positive movement. So it is really a big topic, and there are lots of things within it. There are professions like mine that are in it. There are events like death cafes, documents like advanced care directives, arrangements you can make like home funerals. But really it's a philosophy, and that's kind of where we'll start. And I've narrowed it down to some topics that we can talk about. So the death positive movement, before we get too far, I should tell you that it's not that I'm trying to put a happy face on death. It's not that we're trying to make it a positive thing. We're just trying to make it more acceptable to talk about. All right, so that's kind of where we start. So, decades ago, people might have said in whispered tones, oh, they died of the big C, and that's different from today, where you can talk about cancer and treatment options and go to fundraisers and that kind of thing. So it's really just a shift in perspective. And so when we talk about death positive movement, that term was popularized by a woman named Caitlin Doty about a decade ago in 2011. And she is an American mortician, and she created a website called the orderofthegooddeath.com. You can go to that. And she does a YouTube series called Ask a Mortician. And so on the YouTube series, she would answer people's questions that they had about what she did, and really tried to demystify the process of death and dying. So it's not really trying to make it happy and joyful, but it's just demystifying it, trying to take away some of the mystery, because there's a certain element of mystery that we'll never know. But, oh, you got it. Thank you, Jamie. So, so she really, Caitlin Doty just tried to make it more knowledge, put out her knowledge for people so that it wouldn't be so scary, because sometimes it's just not knowing about something. The unknown makes it scary. So that was kind of her approach, and she's very funny too, so that helps. So I was going to see if I could share my screen and show you the tenets of the death positive movement here. Let's see if we can make that. Can everybody see that? All right, so here are the 8 tenets of the death positive movement, and I'll just read them. And as I read them, just be thinking to yourself, is this something that I agree with or not? You know, you don't have to answer out loud or anything, but just be thinking about it. Okay, so the first one, I believe that by hiding death and dying behind closed doors, we do more harm than good to our society. Number 2, I believe that the culture of silence around death should be broken through discussion, gatherings, art, innovation, and scholarship. Number 3, I believe that talking about and engaging with my inevitable death is not morbid, but displays a natural curiosity about the human condition. Number 4, I believe that the dead body is not dangerous and that everyone should be empowered, should they wish to be involved in care for their own dead. Number 5, I believe that the laws that govern death, dying, and end-of-life care should ensure that a person's wishes are honored, regardless of sexual, gender, racial, or religious identity. Number 6, I believe that my death should be handled in a way that does not do great harm to the environment. Number 7, I believe that my family and friends should know my end-of-life wishes, and that I should have the necessary paperwork to back up those wishes. Number 8, I believe that my open, honest advocacy around death can make a difference and can change culture. All right. So that's kind of what the philosophy is all about. So if you heard those 8 and you're like, yep, I agree with every single one of those, then congratulations, you are part of the death positive movement. Yes. You can go on that website, orderthegooddeath.com, sign a pledge that says you will commit to sharing this information with others if that's what you want to do. If there are a couple that you're like, I don't know, we can talk about those, right? But just to be clear, that's kind of what is driving this whole conversation. But as you all know, movements don't happen in a vacuum, right? There have to be things that come before that kind of set the stage. So, and Jamie, I don't know, I'm just admitting people as they come up.
That's awesome. I haven't been seeing them come in.
Oh, I figured it's because we were co-hosts, so I'm just admitting whoever, so that's okay.
Good, I'm glad, thank you.
Okay, good. So yeah, so as far as the background, there's a lot of foundational wisdom that came about in the 70s and 80s that really made it possible to be where we are now. And some of you probably remember these things. So, you know, there were some books that were really important. If anybody's read The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, that came out in 1973, and On Death and Dying, that came out in 1969 by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. So those kind of books were coming out and really allowing people to sort of rethink what they thought was the best way to kind of deal with death and dying, to look at how other cultures dealt with it, and to examine how we treated people with terminal illnesses in our country. Because until that time, it was really a situation where doctors had been trained to prevent death at all costs. Right? That was, death was the enemy always. And that kind of forgets the fact that we're all mortal and that, you know, mortality rate, last I checked, 100%, right? So we're all going to die, and not to make that it's factual. Right. So while I can understand why doctors are trained the way they are, and we definitely want them to, preserve life as much as they can, there comes a certain point where that's not possible anymore. And so in the 70s that we started to kind of look at that time a little bit differently. And so those books were coming out, and then hospice really became more structured. So hospice as a concept is about taking care of people who are near death. And that's been around for millennia. But in the 70s, in the UK, in England, Cicely Saunders was a nurse who sort of codified how that looked and how we treated those who were dying. So it started in the UK first, and then came over to this country in the late 70s. And so we started to have hospice services. And as most of you know, hospice isn't necessarily a place, it's a service. Now, there can be a place, some hospice providers do have a brick and mortar building, but for on the whole, it's a service. And by 1984, there were 30 of them in this country, according to the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. By 2019, there were 4,500. So a huge growth in hospice services. And this is really because we started thinking differently about how we care for those who are dying. Because if you know about hospice, it is generally a service for people who are within 6 months of dying. Now that's kind of tricky because you were dealing with a great mystery here, but they do evaluations, right? So it's not like you get kicked out, if you haven't. They reevaluate your status and that kind of thing. But all this to say that hospice really exploded in the 80s and has continued because it's a service people need, is what I believe. And then also in the 70s, we had focus on legal documents. So like advanced directives, that became a thing. It used to be people would have a will and that was it, if they were lucky, right? But now advanced directive is a written statement of a person's wishes regarding medical treatment if they're not able to communicate. So can I ask a show of hands who has an advanced directive? Yay! Wonderful, good for you. And I hope everybody has a will. Yes, even a living will, that'd be great too. Yes, yay! Wonderful. So these were all new in the 80s. And so it was really a shift in perspective from, oh, we don't talk about that. Oh, that's morbid. Oh, that's depressing. To no, maybe I should prepare for this inevitable thing that's going to happen. So that was the kind of shift that we saw. And then out of hospice came palliative care. So that is really just comfort care. So where hospice is for those who are no longer pursuing treatment, palliative care you can have at the same time as receiving treatment. It's really just what can we do to mitigate your symptoms and make you comfortable, right? So it's comfort care, but treatment is still a possible thing. So it's kind of a shift. You can have palliative care as soon as you have a diagnosis. And so that's kind of the difference between those two things. Also in the background in the 80s, there was the AIDS epidemic. And this was really a new way for people to see how people were treated as they were dying. And many AIDS activists fought for the fact that a dignified death is a human right. Okay, and so a lot of times people at the time were scared, they didn't know how it was spread and that kind of thing, and it became very political, but it was all sort of in the news. And so people were seeing this and were really sort of forced to figure out how they felt about what were humans guaranteed to. And most of us agree that if at all possible, a dignified death is something that everyone has a right to. So that was going on as well. And then you also had things like other cultures coming in and influencing what we saw around us. So just for example, if you had a family that came here from Mexico and they were used to celebrating Dia de los Muertos, so Day of the Dead, next Monday, got on my shirt for today. So just the way that other cultures dealt with death and dying, because I have to be honest, most other cultures do it better than Americans. So we started to kind of look around us and see, oh, there are other ways that people deal with this thing that happens to all of us. And maybe there's a better way. And so that started to happen. And then as we moved to the 90s, there were some emerging environmental concerns that started to come to the fore. And then you had things like the green burial movement, which Jamie talked about last week, and that became more of a concern. And then out of that, home funerals started happening, and I'll talk more about that later. So all of that is kind of in the background and how we got to where we are now. And it really made the death positive movement possible. So that by 2011, when that term was started to be used, then all these other things had kind of happened to shift the perspective. So that's kind of the background information. So now we can get more specific unless we want to take a break for questions, Jamie? Oh, I can't hear you.
I'm not seeing questions, but I have a question.
Yes.
I am wondering, I'm finding it really interesting, and thank you for this history. I don't really know the history of this. And what's really striking me is how much the death positive goes along with sex positive. And I really think that these are the kinds of things that we're starting to realize they're so taboo, and that's unhealthy.
Right.
And just like, decades ago, we would talk to kids about their body parts by using euphemisms. We still do that with death. You and I don't, but so many of us, even the funeral directors in my office, talk about people passing away, and that's not healthy. So I think that these things are so interesting to see how they kind of, they really go together. That idea of these things that were so taboo, we're starting to break down those taboos.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right on, because Caitlin Doty came up with death positive term based on sex positive, because she was like, wait a minute, there's all this sex positive. Why don't we have the same thing for death? So that is exactly where it came from, because it's having a healthier conversation about it leads you to deal with it better, and it just reminds me, I think it was either Gail Rubin or John Underwood that said, just like talking about sex won't make you pregnant, talking about death won't make you dead. I mean, so it's one of those things where if you're open to talking about it, then you can kind of explore how you feel. But if you don't have the language for it, then you can't even explore it because you don't have the words to say it. So I think that's an excellent comparison, because it's the same thing. Mm-hmm.
John,
yes. Question?
Yeah, very good, Vanessa. I like getting that history also. The thing that I was lamenting about was how has it changed for us? Because I think that even furniture was made back in the 1800s, where they had wasn't a death drawer, it was a shroud drawer or some sort of drawer at the bottom of the dresser that held clothes that were used for burial.
Mm-hmm.
So how has that changed for us as a society from something that was, it seems like, fairly normal, enculturated, to today where it's been kind of a taboo?
Well, there are a couple of reasons. That's a great question. I think the first reason is because we medicalized death. We took it out of our homes and sent it to the hospital. So we didn't have to deal with it. I mean, that was what the front parlor of everyone's room was for. They made wide doors so you could get, the casket through and all that. And so we kind of took it out of the home to where people saw it and put it in the hospital so we don't ever have to see it, which did us a great disservice, in my opinion, because then it became something that you never had to see. And you can be a fully grown adult and have never seen death, right? That's very, very common now. 100 years ago, that was not the case. Right. So I think that's part of it. I think the medicalization of death, and that actually could probably be a whole topic in itself. And Jamie could probably weigh in on how, funeral homes kind of evolved and that kind of thing too. But I think that's the main reason, is that it became not a part of our life anymore, which at first you think, oh, that's great, we don't have to deal with something unpleasant. But in the long term, that's not great.
Well, and kind of keeping in mind how much more medical care we have.
Absolutely.
Like in the 1800s, like even just learning about Spanish flu because of COVID, like at Spanish flu, they didn't even know about viruses. Right. So they didn't know to wash their hands. So kind of keeping in mind all these incredible miracles, basically these medical miracles that really make it so you can live so much longer. Like I think the lifespan has increased maybe like 40 years. And now that idea of you really could be treated for such a long time, but is that considered life? You know what I mean? And we need to think about that. Like what is that, with the path of least resistance being way more medical care versus kind of thinking the path of least resistance is letting a natural process happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, because people are living so much longer, it's definitely different. I heard like 100 years ago, the mortality rate was very different. It was, much, much higher for under 15, and now it's switched, and now it's for over 65, and so things have changed medically that have allowed us to live longer and to take care of those things. But at some point along the way, it's like, oh, hold on, wait, we need to maybe rethink how we are doing things. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm going to keep going. If you have questions, just raise your hand or put them in the chat. So I'll talk about what I do. So I am an end-of-life doula, but I go by many names, depending on how comfortable you are with the word death. So death doula, death midwife, death companion, death coach. I use end-of-life doula usually for people who are not as comfortable with the word death, but then I have to explain what a doula is too. So whatever you're comfortable with, there are a lot of names out there. So the word doula is an ancient Greek word. It comes from the term for a servant, someone who usually did caregiving. And so that's where the word comes from. I offer non-medical, emotional, spiritual, and informational support. So that's what I do. And it's usually, ideally would be at the time of diagnosis, but you know how those things go. It's usually, I have the same problem as hospice. People wait very, very late to call me, which I'm glad that they do. But the sooner I'm called, the more help I can offer. So I'm very similar to a birth doula, if you've heard of that. Birth doulas came about in the early 70s as well. They are people who help people who are giving birth, right? So they help with that milestone to make sure that the person is comfortable, that the environment is what they want. Again, they are not medical, but they do everything else. So the emotional, spiritual, informational support during a life milestone. So what I do is very similar to a birth doula, but it's on the other end. It's the other life milestone that we all have. And a big difference is that most people like to talk about birth and babies, and most people do not like to talk about death and dying. So, but you know, in the early 70s, this was a new thing. now, and some people still don't know what a birth doula is, and that's fine, but most people who are pregnant know what one is. And so that it's become more well-known and more popular and helpful to a lot of people. So I always try and look at what birth doulas went through as far as getting the word out and sharing how this can be helpful during this life experience. Because I feel like we're on a similar path. But yeah, I have a few more challenges because death doesn't, it's not as happy as birth. So in 2003, a man named Henry Firsco Weiss, he's was a social worker in a hospice in New Jersey. And he was really distraught over how he wasn't able to help his patients more because Medicare had taken over hospice in the 80s, which on the one hand was great because it became available to everyone. But on the other hand, there was a lot of paperwork to do, and caseloads were really getting high for nurses and social workers and other people in hospice. So Henry Firsco Weiss created a group called the International End of Life Doula Association. So the acronym is INELDA, and that's where I did my training. Now there are many, many trainings. There's one through the University of Vermont. There's Going with Grace. There's Conscious Dying Institute in Boulder. So there are many, and those are ones that have been around kind of for a while. But the death doula is meant to fill in the gaps that you might see between medical care and hospice care. So if they're, so this is why I call what I do supplemental support. It's usually on top of palliative care or hospice care, but not always. You don't, have to have that to come to me. But what I usually do is fill in the gaps that might be there. A lot of times people think when they go on hospice that somebody will be there 24/7, and that is absolutely not true. So that's unfortunate, but that's kind of the way it is that you get a team, and you guys probably know this, of a doctor, a nurse, a social worker, a chaplain, a CNA, and they come see you periodically. Right? So maybe twice a week, something like that, just depending on how many other patients they have. So the very different thing is that I'm an independent provider. So I'm not part of Medicare. I'm not a part of insurance either. So good and bad, right? So it's private pay, but I only have one or two clients at a time. And so the thing that I offer is time. I can stay for however long you need. I don't have to go see somebody else. I don't have to document it for somebody. And I'm completely flexible in whatever the person who is dying or their loved ones need. So, maybe nobody has eaten. I can go to the grocery store for them, or walk the dog. I can do that. But what I primarily do is help the person who's dying kind of come to terms with what is happening to them. So that's where that emotional and spiritual support really come in. But if there are other things that, you can't really get to talking about your grief over your grandmother who died if there's, if people are worried about dinner, right? So it's like, I try and assess the needs of the family when I go in. And so I support patients before, during, and after death, as well as their connected circle of family and community. And it's really individualized for every client because every one of us is different. And what support looks like to me might not be what it looks like to you. So my job is to really go in and find out what is needed, and to kind of assess family dynamics in a way that will lead to a peaceful transition. That is my goal ultimately, is to make sure that the person has a peaceful transition. And this is where we can start to talk about a good death, right? So in the death positive movement, you can talk about things like a good death, because knowing that I can't take away the sorrow, I can't take away the sadness, but maybe there's a way to make this thing that's going to happen, this experience that you're going to go through, maybe the lead up to it, there are things that we can do to make it easier for you, you know, so maybe a better death than it would be. Because I'm sure some of you have seen really beautiful deaths, and some of you have seen really terrible ones. I mean, so there are things that you can do prior to that happening that make a difference. And so it's my job to kind of find out what those things are for you, right? I take myself out of it and I find out, well, what's important to this person and to this family? You know, are there cultural things that I should know about? Most people say they want to die in their own homes, but is that possible in this case? Are they in a facility? Are they in a hospital? And if they are, can we move the bed to be by a window? You know, can I bring in essential oils for aromatherapy? Can we, are candles allowed, you know, or do I need like an electric candle, whatever? Are there people that you want to see? Or is there somebody that you absolutely do not want to see? Well, I can be that gatekeeper to say, to make sure they don't come in the room, you know? And sometimes it's easier if it's someone who's not in the family, who's not in that circle of community. But as you can see, it's very individual and different for the person. So, and I also can help coordinate these services. So if you've ever been in the position of having a loved one die, you know, there are a lot of things going on, people coming in and out all the time. And not that that's a bad thing, but it's a lot of activity. And if you are grieving, and if someone close to you is dying, then you're definitely grieving. It's probably anticipatory grief, right? It hasn't happened yet, but it's coming and you know it. Then you might need some support on keeping up with all that stuff, because our brains are not working at 100% capacity when we are in grief. And so I try and keep up with that 3-ring circus for the family, you know, and can coordinate in that way. And so again, ideally, if I can be brought on soon after diagnosis, then that's really good. But typically it becomes towards the end when it's an urgent situation, which is not ideal, but I offer what help I can at that time. So the way that I was trained, there are 3 main things that I work on with people. They are life review, vigil planning, and legacy projects. So life review is something that most people are open to, especially if they've received a terminal diagnosis. And ideally, this would be something that's done over several months. But as I said, you know, I do what I can in the time that I have. So life review is talking to people about what their lives have been like. And this is where we try and shift the focus a little bit, because we know there's going to be loss, but maybe instead of focusing on that loss, we can focus on the life that has been lived. And that helps to sort of integrate more what's going on. My background, another previous life, I was a high school English teacher. So stories are always important to me, have always been important. So it's really trying to get to know that person's story and what impact did they have on those around them, and what impact did others have on them, and kind of looking for those themes of your life and what your time on earth was all about. That really helps people to get to some sort of closure, and helps them to process what's happening. Another thing I do for life review is it's primarily deep, active listening. This is hard for loved ones and family to do for you if you're dying, because they're so in their grief and anticipating the loss that it's hard to just listen compassionately. And so I try and provide that listening ear. And a lot of times we talk about there's an acronym that you can remember if you're ever in this situation and don't have access to a doula, RUGS. So regrets, unfinished business, guilt, and shame. Those are the 4 things that if people have the opportunity to talk to someone, even if it's someone that's not related to them, someone that has a compassionate listening ear about their regrets, their unfinished business, their guilt, or their shame that they're trying to deal with, if you can kind of just bear witness to that, then that allows for a much more peaceful passing. And so, because at the end, you know, of course, people go their whole lives and they try and do what's right, but maybe at the end, there were some things that they just didn't quite get to, you know, if you can just listen to those, that provides a sense of relief for people. And you can help them achieve that peaceful passing, because that's what we want. And so I definitely take all judgment out, and I'm listening to people when they talk about these things. And in this way, we can not only shift the perspective from the loss to the life lived, but we can also shift the perspective from fear and anxiety to one of love and meaning. You know, what was the meaning behind these events that happened to you? Look at the love that is surrounding you, that kind of thing. It allows for a shift in perspective. And so you can really set the stage for a more peaceful passing in the end. So the other thing that I really focus on, life review, most people are open to. And as a death doula, what I do is I come in, kind of read the room and figure out what the need is and offer things, right? I'm never going to try and convince somebody of anything, but I offer tools. These are all just tools that are available to people at the end of their lives. So life review, most people are open to. Another one is vigil planning. And this is kind of 50-50. It just depends on what kind of person you are. So vigil planning is making a plan in advance for those final hours and days. So likely you will not be able to communicate. And if you're not, let's decide in advance what you need around you, who you need around you. Do you want your dog in the bed with you? You know, do you want everybody around you holding hands? What is it that is the ideal situation for you? So we're going to assume that you're not in pain, okay, because we've got meds on and you've got a whole medical care team taking part of that piece, taking care of that piece. So what other things can we do that make you feel spiritually supported? You know, are there prayers that we can say? Are there actions we can do that make you feel emotionally supported? That kind of thing. And let's talk about that before. Yeah, Jamie, you got a question?
Yeah. And if anybody else has questions, please ask them. So what I hear a lot is that so many people will be sitting at the bedside with their loved one for, you know, days, and they finally go home to take a shower, or they have to go make a phone call or whatever. And that's when their loved one dies. And so I just wondered, like, do you find in the vigil planning, what are people saying? Are they typically saying that they want people around them, or I just wonder, I mean, I'm assuming that most of the people I hear about, they didn't have vigil planning. They haven't had this conversation.
Yeah, most people have not had this conversation at all. And so just things happen as they do. The people I have done vigil planning with generally do want people to be there. And that's hard to do, to have somebody 24 hours, you know, a day. So you can do in shifts, and I certainly help out with that. But you're absolutely right. A lot of times, that's when the person will die, is when nobody is there. And the thing is, sometimes I think that people want it that way. You know, maybe they've had their children around them and holding them in loving care, but this last thing is maybe something they want to do on their own. And you know, we have to respect that, because what we want for our own selves is not what anybody else might want. So things happen as they do, but that's definitely something that we would talk about. Do you want people around you? Do you want to do this on your own? And how can we respect your wishes? That's basically it, is figuring out what people want so that the family doesn't have to turn themselves inside out trying to figure out, is this what they wanted?
Well, and I just wonder, is it hard for people to leave when their loved ones are there? I remember one time I was with a friend of mine who was a client and then became a good friend, a Holocaust survivor, a woman named Bella Zickerman. I actually wear this tie that she gave me. And I was by her bedside when she was, dying. And she would take such long time between breaths, and then something would happen in another part of the house and she would come back into her body, and it was really like she was distracted. She couldn't get to where she needed to be because there were things happening in the house. And so I have to sort of wonder, is it hard to go if people are sitting with you?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there is an element to that. I mean, it's different for everybody, but what our bodies are doing is shutting down, right? It's a completely natural process. Now, whatever the disease is will do what it's going to do, but dying itself is a natural process. It's not a medical process. It's a communal event, really. And so if you're looking at it as a natural process, just like birth, there are things that happen, right? And we, as people who have been pregnant, you can learn about that ahead of time. Well, death is the same way. And if you're open to that information, I can tell you the things that will happen to the physical body. Now, your nurse may not want to tell you all those things, right? But I believe knowledge is power. So if you're open and want to know it, I can tell you that your systems start to slow down, and your skin changes color and your breathing gets very, very slow, and the apnea starts to happen. And so these are the signs that let us know that you are in the phase called active dying. And that's what the vigil planning is for, is those last, and it can be a couple of hours or it can be up to 2 weeks, but that active, and that's when people are like, oh my gosh. And it's really hard because you're trying to be supportive, but that's a long time, but again, this is even a bigger mystery than birth because no woman's been pregnant for a year, you know what I mean? But plenty of people have taken over a year to die. Now, not the active dying phase, that's the very, very end. But Jamie, I think you're right, because think about it, the systems are closing down, right? The stomach is like, I'm done, right? Especially if they're not eating or having any nutrition or anything, that system is no longer needed. And so things are starting to shut down to where it's really the brain and the heart is kind of left. And hearing is the last sense to go. So always talk if you're around because they can hear you. And think about it, if your hearing is still intact and you're hearing people that you love, it might make it harder to say goodbye because you want to engage still, right? And so it's like, when you're, I just have the image of if you're on a boat and waving goodbye, it's harder and harder to see them, but you're trying, and so, and that's kind of wrapped with sadness in that. I think for us, the survivors, rather than the person dying, I mean, who can know, right? We don't know. But I think you're right that sometimes it brings them back. So like I had a client who recently did VSED. So it's an acronym, VSED. It stands for Voluntary Stopping Eating and Drinking. And that's something that's legal in all 50 states. But I had to really tell people, okay, well, don't engage in conversation when you come in the room because it makes it really hard to disconnect, right? And so like things like soft music, those things are fine, but it's, if you're hearing the voice, they may want to still connect with you on that human level. And really, they're going to a spirit level, and that's going to be a different form of communication afterwards. Yeah.
And I'm convinced there is that communication afterwards too.
Yeah.
And you know that too.
Yeah. It's different for sure. So let's see, as far as vigil planning, we definitely will talk about like, what things do you want to happen right after the death? I always encourage families to take their time. If you are in the room and someone has died, don't be in a hurry to call someone because that train will start very soon and there's no stopping it, right? There's a lot of things that happen afterwards. So I really encourage people to take their time and say their goodbyes in the way that they can. Spend an hour if that's what you need. If you are in a hospital and want to get a washcloth and gently clean the body in that way, take your time. It really helps psychologically for us to process what has happened. And then there will be many, many decisions that have to happen later. So the more time you can allow yourself to sit in that sacred space, because to me it is a sacred space, then do that. So I really try and encourage people to be patient for that. Because that train will start. But if we can talk about those things before we get there, it's better. It's easier. If we don't have that time and it's an urgent situation, then I kind of triage as I can and figure out what's the most important thing. My last client that I had, I was brought in 5 days before she died. So I know that now. I didn't know that then, right? So I kind of have to assess. And at that time, the biggest thing that she was dealing with was this existential angst about what is going to happen to me, what I consider me, when I die. And so we really worked to uncover that fear and what that was about. And I felt like I was able to help a little bit to help her get to a more peaceful place. And so I was grateful to have been given that opportunity for her. And I think it helped. But yeah, the sooner I'm brought in, the easier those conversations will go. So that's vigil planning. And then the last thing that I kind of focus on, so life review, vigil planning, and legacy projects. Legacy projects are like a tangible item or process that helps people to deal with their grief. And generally it's something that we might start during the active dying phase. So for example, if everyone's coming to see the person, and when they come in, maybe there are index cards on a table or a notebook, and they write down like their favorite memory of that person, right? And then after the death, I work with the family and we take the cards and we create some art project with it, or we go around and read them out loud. So that kind of tangible object. Or it could be a process. Maybe they were a great cook, and they had a soup that they made for Halloween every year, and then have everybody bring an ingredient and they make that soup and they talk about that person together. So these are just ways that you can have to remember and to help process what has happened and honor that person, right? We're coming up. Day of the Dead is all about honoring your ancestors. So how can we honor this life that has been lived? And of course, that's different for every person. Maybe they were a big hiker. Maybe there's an event where you get all the friends to go do a 14er, So it really is individual, very individualized, personalized. But it's a way to kind of help those who are left to kind of process what has happened. And ideally, the person that died would have been there at the beginning, to help start it. And then at the end, then they can be remembered. So in all of this, my goal is a peaceful transition for the person. So while I do serve the family and really want to help them process their grief as they go, my main client is the person who's dying. Right. So that's who my number one client is. And then everybody kind of extending around that.
And
So,
Vanessa,
yeah,
there's a couple of questions in the
Okay.
chat. John would like to see your shirt again. So will you please show?
Sure.
And
This is
Jim
it.
and go ahead. And then Jim and Deb are wondering, what is the biggest challenge in helping the dying person and the family to let go?
Wow, that's a good question, but it is absolutely different for every person. It really is different because it depends on the situation. Has it been a long protracted illness? And so maybe the challenge is, oh, I'm feeling guilty about this sense of relief that I feel coming, or was it a completely sudden thing? And oh my gosh, we didn't ever talk about this. And I always wanted to talk about this, So it really depends on the illness, depends on the person, depends on the family dynamics. Are there young children involved? That's a whole different thing than if there are adult children who live far away. So is there one family member that's been doing everything and the other family members don't really know the full situation that's going on? I mean, there are just so many different things that it could be. So that's part of what I do is assess that, figure out, okay, in this one situation with this person in this family, what are the challenges? What are the challenges that are here to allow them to be able to let go? And is it a spiritual thing or not? Are there two different spiritual beliefs that are in conflict with each other? So maybe the dying person isn't worried at all. And they're like, I'm going to be in heaven. It's all good. And I'm going to be at the pearly gates or whatever. And maybe their daughter is like, Mom, I don't believe that at all. So, is there that kind of conflict happening? I mean, there are so many different challenges that could happen. So I'd really have to just see. I'll say I haven't had the same one yet. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. We good? Anything else?
Do we have other questions? Yeah, and other questions, please, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. I'm having Zoom trouble, so I can't see if you raise your hand. I've had to open up on my phone now.
Yeah. Oh no.
But please do ask Vanessa questions.
Sure. And how are we doing on time? Oh, we're getting to the end and I haven't even talked about the other. Okay. I'll speed through the other ones. I don't know as much about, I know some, but that was what I know mostly about because that's what I do. Okay. So we'll move on to home funerals. And I will say that home funerals, you should know, are safe, are possible, and they are legal in all 50 states. So you can do that, and it is legal to have a loved one's body at home after they die. So if you do this, you will have to look into ice packs and things. So that's something that you would need to know, but is completely legal. Now, the reason you would do it is it helps the family sort of maintain some control after the death has happened. And it's a beautiful and healing experience for loved ones. This is something, 150 years ago, this was just a funeral. So now we call it a home funeral to distinguish it from a regular funeral. But home funerals were the norm, 150, 200 years. That's just how they did things. That's why they had the front parlor and all that. So home funerals are often more affordable than a traditional funeral, and they can be very personal and tailored to the family's needs. Now, you can do this at home. There are 9 states where you do need a funeral director involved, but I don't think Colorado is one of them.
No, I don't think Colorado is one of them either. But what I will say is if you need help, and most people do because we don't know how to do this.
Right.
Feldman's has helped with this. So we had a family, it was actually a prearranged plan. A woman wanted to stay in her house for 3 days before she was cremated, and we made that plan. And at the time of her death, her daughter called us. We came over with the ice packs.
Yeah.
We helped the family to know what to do. We were there as support. We got the death certificate, which is not easy. We got the permitting for the cremation. And then when they were ready for the cremation to happen, we came and got her. So just so you know, you can do a hybrid too. And that can be really, really, just as you said, really healing if that's what you want to do. And it's again, all about having conversations ahead of time.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So, and that's a beautiful way to do it. A death doula can help you with this. And also National Home Funeral Alliance. Jamie, I don't know if you can get that homefuneralalliance.org website, but they have all kinds of guides there to help you do this in your own home. And the reason you would do it, again, is it's very personal, sometimes more affordable, and really helps to heal and process this loss. But to feel confident in doing it, you probably do need help. So Home Funeral Alliance, places like Feldman, people like me can help you with that for sure. But it is something I'd say talk about ahead of time. And then the last topic I was going to cover is death cafes. And I know Jamie hosted one. Do you still do it?
I haven't been doing it.
Okay.
We were doing it in person at the Denver Library, and then we are doing it on Zoom, and then nobody was coming. So we stopped.
Okay. So I host one on Zoom as well. It's been online since COVID, and we've had a pretty good turnout. So if you haven't heard of death cafes, again, 2011 seemed to be the year that things started to coalesce for death positive movement, because that's when death cafes were started by a man named John Underwood in England, and his mom, who was a therapist, and they were looking for ways to kind of better deal with death and dying. So a death cafe is when people, often strangers, they gather to eat cake, drink tea, and discuss death. Right? So it sounds morbid maybe to you, but it's absolutely not. It is the most incredible conversations you will ever have with strangers. It really restores my faith in humanity every month that I go, because people are so thoughtful and compassionate. The objective is to increase awareness of death with a view of helping people to make the most of their finite lives. So people come to a death cafe knowing we're all mortal, we're all going to die. How do we deal with that knowledge, right? And so to talk to other people about that, and to have a safe space where you can talk about those things. So my group used to be at the Bemis Library in Littleton. So now it's online. I think most of them are. You can go to deathcafe.org and just plug in your zip code if you want to find one near you. Or, it's been fascinating since we've been online. People come from all over. So we usually have 10 to 20 at ours. Nancy English runs them. She's been doing it for years. So it's always a really good crowd. But people come from all over the state. They come from Chicago, from California. We've had one come from Germany, one come from Hungary. I mean, it's fascinating because, it's all of us. And if you can speak English, we can talk to each other. So it's really a great space to talk to other people. It is not a support group. So I would say don't go if you've had a very recent loss. And it's not a counseling session either. So it's just a group directed discussion on death with no agenda. So you can't sell anything or convince people of anything like that. Okay. So it's not for profit. It's in an accessible, respectful, confidential space. And no intention of leading people to conclusions or products. There's always refreshing food and drink. We kind of deal with things better if we have something to eat and drink. And anyone who's interested can host. So if you are active in your church or your apartment building and you want to host one, you can completely do that. Go to deathcafe.org and they have a guide there. It's super easy. You just facilitate conversation. That's basically what it's about. And there is another thing, if you just like say want to do something with your friends, your close friends, and you want to have something more structured, there's a Death Over Dinner, which was created by Michael Hebb. And that's more like you read an article and talk about it, or you see a movie about a topic with death and talk about it. So that's more structured, and they have a website too. So that's Death Over Dinner. But Death Cafe is kind of free form, and anybody can go and anybody can host. So that's kind of all I have now that I think we're at ones.
We are at one. I don't know why we're having all this feedback now.
Oh, it's because you're on two different ones.
No, I have my sound turned off somewhere.
Here, let me mute that one.
Thank
Now-
you.
Okay.
This computer issue. Vanessa, thank you. This was fabulous. People in the chat are asking for if you have a brochure. So if you do,
yeah.
will you please share that with me and I will email that out to everybody.
Mhm.
I also will email out the video of this. And I just really appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. I appreciate it. Thanks everybody for coming.
Yeah, thank you for coming. And this is our last time together this time, but we'll have these again. So we just really love seeing everybody, and stay healthy and well.
Wonderful. Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Vanessa.
You're
Okay,
welcome.
bye-bye.
Thanks, Jamie. Bye-bye.